I too would just like to particularly thank Michael and Paul. It was a very difficult gig, but they did very well. They'd done their homework, they'd read all the submissions, and I think it was that insight and that knowledge that carried what I regarded as one of the best discussions I've seen in a forum of this type in the whole time that I've been in politics. Now, I know that might be seen in a cynical way by some outside this room, but I think most people would agree that the quality of the discussion here today and yesterday has been a very high quality. And I think it's been informative. I think it's fair to say that we've all learnt a lot from the experience that we've had here. I've certainly been heartened by the fact that there's a lot of support for the government's program of tax reform that we're currently putting in place. But I'm sure I've learnt a lot about that today, and there's ways in which we can do better in the future. But what today and yesterday has been all about is the next steps in tax reform, going through a whole range of issues on which there is agreement and disagreement, and a whole lot of issues which go to the very core of our future prosperity. But I am confident that we have identified some of the next steps in tax reform. I think we've heard about how complex tax reform can be. We've heard that there aren't necessarily simple solutions, but we've heard, I think, and learnt that we can do better if we keep talking. And I think that will be a lesson that the government will draw upon as we go through the next steps. The area I want to start with, first of all, is in business tax reform. I'll say something about that. I'll say something about federal-state reform, personal tax and transfers, and just mention a few other issues along the way. But I think the discussion we had yesterday morning about business tax reform was very important. And in many ways it was dominated about ideas as to how to respond to the pressures of a patchwork economy, acknowledging that, given our place in the region, the prospects for our economy in the long term are good, but challenged by some fundamental changing circumstances in our outlook. Now, there were different views in the room about the need for an across-the-board company tax cut. As you know, the Henry Review recommended a cut from 30 to 25. I think the Australian Industry Group and the Business Council still argue for a progression down to 25. But we heard others in the room say that they didn't agree with that, the ACTU and ACOS, to name a couple. And of course there were some who said that for them a cut in the company tax rate was not necessarily the most important priority. But what really came through that discussion yesterday morning to me was that there was some common ground in the middle of all of that. That is the need for more targeted measures to help struggling businesses in the circumstances of strong structural change within our economy. And as we know that in the original tax review there was also discussion of how we treated company tax losses. So the debate became, do we go for a big hit in terms of a big cut to our company tax rate, or do we look to more targeted responses, particularly in the short term? Some people argued strongly in favour of more targeted responses. Others who talked about losses in the room came from a variety of organisations and tax experts. So I think there was common ground, and I think in that common ground there is a way forward. So what the government will do is ask Chris Jordan to chair a business tax reform working group. And the purpose of that business tax reform working group is to bring together business leaders, tax experts, unions. It will be supported by the Treasury. And what it will do is look at business tax responses to a patchwork economy and, of course, how to fund them. In these times of patchwork pressures more than ever, I think business does need the flexibility to make the leaps of inventiveness that have always made our country strong. And in taking some steps in this area, I think we could make a very big contribution to the long-term strength of our economy. So the first priority of this group is to identify options for losses and options for savings to fund them. It will provide an initial report in November and a final report by March next year. It will consider things like loss carryback, uplifting losses, and what happens to the value of losses when business change composition or ownership. The working group should also identify ways to fund these ideas from business tax. Now, the AIG, the AWU and Saul Eslake all talked about whether we target the company tax cut rate a bit better or do we go ahead with an across-the-board rate? ACOS talked about opportunities for companies to shift profits offshore. So there are a number of options for savings, but there are a lot of other options as well. Now, the second priority of this group will be to look at longer-term company tax options and report back by 2012. And these, of course, were the options that were identified in the Henry Review, which is the equity allowance, whether that particular approach could work. So it should compare all of these ideas when it comes to company tax rates in the context of a longer-term direction. And bearing in mind, if we're going to fund these changes, then we need to identify the savings that will fund them. Now, we also heard quite a bit from small business. I particularly enjoyed the contribution from Peter Strong. I know I've got to get out there and get to his bookshop pretty soon, and he can take me through all of those challenges that he's been talking about today. And there is no doubt that when it comes particularly to complexity, this is very challenging, particularly for those sole operators that he was talking about. Now, the instant asset write-off that we're putting forward, which commenced next year, I think is going to be a very important initiative for small business, and we're going to introduce that at $6,500 per item, I might add. But I would make the point, because this is not just a benefit in terms of cash flow, but it is something that can really give a boost to small businesses, and we will take any opportunity to take that further should our financial circumstances allow us to do that. Now, of course, there is much happening in the areas of standard business reporting, and we've got the superannuation clearinghouse, all designed to reduce the burden, and we want to see how much further we can go in that area. So I've asked the Treasury and the ATO to put their heads together so we can work with Peter Strong and others that are interested to make sure we do identify the best ways to reduce that complexity. Now, the second area that there was a lot of discussion about, and in some ways a very encouraging discussion, was in the area of federal-state tax reform. I think this was in many ways probably the most passionate session that we had. And I do remember Michael Pascoe making the point that there wasn't one person in the audience who would put up their hand to support one or more of the 200 taxes that had been identified as being inefficient. Now, the fact is that there are challenges with the state taxation base. Stamp duties harm labour mobility and housing affordability. Insurance taxes discourage people at risk from taking out insurance. And, of course, that is the whole issue of the efficiency